Princess Valen Kithara stood at the observation deck of the diplomatic transport Harmony's Edge, watching the contested world of Nexus Prime grow larger through the reinforced viewport. The planet's surface showed the scars of 2 decades of intermittent conflict, abandoned settlements, orbital defense platforms from both human and Kithara forces, and the kind of environmental damage that happened when 2 civilizations tried to claim the same resources through force rather than negotiation. "Your Highness," came the voice of General Viron behind her, "the human delegation's transport has just entered the system. They're requesting permission to land at the agreed coordinates." Valen didn't turn from the viewport, her pointed ears twitching slightly as she processed the information. "Granted, General. And remind our people that we're here to prevent a war, not start one." "The humans are the volatile ones, Your Highness," Viron replied, his tone carrying the mixture of respect and concern that characterized most interactions with the Imperial heir. "Our intelligence reports suggest they're likely to make emotional decisions based on incomplete information. Which is precisely why we must remain calm and rational," Valen said, finally turning to face the general. "Human unpredictability is their greatest weakness and their greatest strength. They'll take risks that no sane species would consider, which makes them both dangerous enemies and potentially valuable allies." She moved away from the viewport, her ceremonial robes flowing around her with the fluid grace that marked Kithara nobility. The garments were designed to project authority, deep blue fabric that seemed to capture starlight, with silver threading that formed patterns recognizable to any student of imperial symbology. Her long dark hair was arranged in a complex style that indicated her status as heir apparent, and the crystal circlet resting just above her pointed ears caught the ship's artificial lighting with deliberate brilliance. "Have you reviewed the files on their primary negotiator?" Valen asked as they walked through the ship's corridors toward the landing bay. "Captain Marcus Reed, Human Colonial Defense Force," Viron recited from memory. "Age 34, decorated veteran of the periphery conflicts, currently assigned to diplomatic liaison duties. Educational background in both military strategy and interspecies relations. No apparent political ambitions beyond his current assignment. Psychological profile. Stable, methodical, shows above-average emotional control for a human. Known for unconventional tactical thinking and unusual loyalty to abstract principles like justice and civilian protection." Valen suppressed a smile at Viron's tone when discussing human moral concepts. "Those abstract principles are what make them so unpredictable, General. A rational species would calculate the costs and benefits of any action. Humans will sacrifice significant advantages to satisfy their emotional need to do the right thing. Which makes them impossible to negotiate with effectively," Viron said. "Or," Valen countered, "it means they can be trusted to keep agreements that serve their moral framework, even when those agreements become inconvenient. The question is whether we can align our interests with their sense of justice." The landing bay was already bustling with activity as the crew prepared for the human delegation's arrival. Valen had insisted on greeting them personally, a gesture that would demonstrate respect while also allowing her to assess their leadership firsthand. Protocol demanded that she maintain appropriate dignity, but she also knew that humans responded well to what they perceived as personal attention from authority figures. "Your Highness," said Commander THYSS, approaching with a data pad. "The advance team reports that Captain Reed's transport is carrying a smaller delegation than expected. Only 12 personnel instead of the agreed-upon 20. Interesting," Valen mused. "Either they're demonstrating trust by bringing fewer guards, or they're planning something that requires a more mobile team. Should we adjust our security protocols?" "No. But make sure our people are prepared for either possibility." Valen straightened her circlet and checked her appearance in a nearby reflective surface. First impressions were crucial in diplomacy, especially when dealing with a species that made decisions based on emotional responses to visual and social cues. The human transport ship was utilitarian in the way that characterized most of their military designs, functional, heavily armored, and completely lacking in the aesthetic considerations that Kithara architects considered essential. It settled onto the landing bay deck with mechanical precision, its landing jets creating enough noise and heat to make several of the Kithra delegation step back instinctively. When the transport's ramp lowered, Valen got her first look at Captain Marcus Reed in person rather than through intelligence briefings and holographic recordings. He was tall for a human, with the kind of controlled posture that suggested military training without the rigid formality that some officers adopted as a psychological defense. His uniform was regulation but showed signs of practical use rather than ceremonial maintenance, and when he removed his service cap, she could see that his brown hair was shorter than current human fashion but longer than strict military standards might require. But it was his eyes that caught her attention, steady, alert, and showing none of the nervous energy that characterized most humans in high-stress situations. When their gazes met across the landing bay, she saw him take in her royal regalia and ceremonial positioning without any of the obvious awe or intimidation that many species displayed when meeting Kithra nobility. "Your Highness," Captain Reed said, approaching with his delegation and offering the precise bow that indicated he'd studied proper diplomatic protocol. "Thank you for receiving us. I'm Captain Marcus Reed, representing the Human Colonial Defense Force and the Nexus Prime Settlement Authority." "Captain Reed," Valen replied, inclining her head with exactly the degree of respect due to a military officer of his rank representing a sovereign power. "Welcome aboard the Harmony's Edge. I am Princess Valen Kithra, speaking for the Stellar Dominion and my mother, Empress Thiel. The honor is mine, Your Highness. I bring greetings from Colonial Governor Harrison and hopes that our discussions will lead to lasting peace in this system." Valen studied his expression as he spoke, noting the careful diplomacy of his words and the genuine sincerity in his tone. No obvious deception, no barely concealed hostility, no attempts to project more authority than his position warranted. Either Captain Reed was an exceptionally skilled negotiator, or he actually meant what he was saying. "I share those hopes, Captain," she said. "Though I suspect we both understand that hope alone won't be sufficient to resolve 2 decades of conflict." "No, Your Highness. But it's a better starting point than mutual suspicion and threat displays." "An admirably practical perspective," Valen said, and meant it. "General Viron will show your people to their quarters, and we can begin formal discussions tomorrow morning. I trust your journey was uneventful." "As uneventful as any trip through contested space can be," Reed replied with what might have been humor. "Though I noticed your orbital defense platforms have some impressive targeting systems. Very thorough coverage. The Dominion believes in being prepared for various contingencies," Valen said blandly. "As I'm sure the Colonial Defense Force does as well." "Of course, Your Highness." As the delegations separated and the humans were escorted to their accommodations, Valen found herself reviewing her initial assessment of Captain Reed. He'd said nothing surprising, made no obvious mistakes, and conducted himself with exactly the kind of professional competence she'd expected from his file. But there had been something in his demeanor, a quality of attention, perhaps, or a way of listening that suggested he was actually interested in what she had to say rather than simply waiting for his turn to speak. "Initial impressions, Your Highness?" General Viron asked as they made their way toward the diplomatic conference room. "Exactly what I expected," Valen said. "Which means either the humans have become much better at concealing their volatility, or Captain Reed is not a typical representative of his species. And which do you think is more likely?" Valen considered this as they walked through corridors lined with artwork that celebrated 1,000 years of Kithra civilization, stability, order, the triumph of rational thought over chaotic emotion. "I think," she said finally, "that Captain Reed may be the most dangerous kind of human, one who's learned to channel their unpredictability without losing it entirely." "Dangerous how?" "Dangerous because he might actually be someone we can work with," Valen replied. "And that kind of hope can lead to very poor decision-making." Thiron's expression suggested he thought his princess might already be engaging in the kind of poor decision-making she'd just warned against, but he was too well trained to say so directly. Valen spent the rest of the evening reviewing intelligence reports and preparing for the next day's negotiations, but she found her thoughts returning repeatedly to the moment when Captain Reed had looked at her without flinching, without obvious calculation, and without any apparent desire to be anywhere else. It was, she realized, the first time in years that anyone had looked at her and seen something other than a political opportunity or obstacle. The formal negotiations began at what humans called 0800 hours, and Kithra measured as third harmony of the day cycle, but the real diplomacy had started during the previous evening's cultural exchange dinner. Valen had watched Captain Reed navigate alien cuisine and unfamiliar customs with the same careful attention he brought to everything else, neither feigning enthusiasm for foods that were clearly outside his experience nor showing the disgust that many humans displayed when confronted with Kithra culinary traditions. The humans want guaranteed access to the Kepler mineral fields, General Thyron was saying, reviewing the morning's opening positions. In exchange, they're offering to recognize Dominion sovereignty over the southern continent and cessation of expansion into the Thyel system. Valen studied the holographic map floating above the conference table, its three-dimensional display showing the complex web of competing claims and strategic interests that had led to 2 decades of intermittent warfare. What they're really asking for is validation of their colonial methodology, she said. Strip mining rights in exchange for acknowledging that we own territory they can't realistically contest anyway. A typical human negotiating tactic, Thyron agreed. Demand everything, offer little, and hope the other party will split the difference. Actually, said Captain Reed's voice from the conference room doorway, we prefer to think of it as establishing maximum negotiating parameters so we can find mutually beneficial compromises. Valen turned to face him, noting that he'd arrived precisely on time and was carrying data pads that suggested he'd spent the night reviewing his own intelligence briefings. Captain Reed. I trust you slept well despite being surrounded by potentially volatile aliens. Reed's slight smile suggested he'd caught her reference to her own public statements about human unpredictability. I find that most species are less volatile when they're not actively being threatened, Your Highness. Though I did notice your security protocols are quite thorough. As are yours, I imagine, Valen replied as they took their seats around the conference table. Shall we begin with your proposal regarding the mineral fields? The next 3 hours were a masterclass in diplomatic positioning, with both sides presenting carefully prepared arguments for why their positions represented the only reasonable path to lasting peace. Valen found herself impressed despite her prejudices by the depth of Reed's preparation and his apparent genuine concern for civilian populations caught in the crossfire of imperial politics. The mining operations would provide employment for local populations from both species, Reed was explaining, using holographic displays to show projected economic impacts. Shared infrastructure, joint oversight, revenue distribution based on proportional investment rather than territorial claims. An interesting proposal, Valen acknowledged. But it assumes that humans and Kithra can work together effectively on complex long-term projects. Our species have very different approaches to resource management and environmental stewardship. Which could be complementary rather than conflicting, Reed replied. Human efficiency and adaptability, combined with Kithra stability and long-term planning. The result might be better than either species could achieve independently. Valen's pointed ears twitched slightly, a sign of interest that she hoped Reed wouldn't recognize. You sound remarkably optimistic about interspecies cooperation, Captain. Most humans I've encountered seem to believe that their way of doing things is inherently superior. Most Kithra I've encountered seem to believe that humans are inherently chaotic and untrustworthy, Reed countered mildly. Perhaps we're both working with incomplete information. The observation hung in the air between them, challenging assumptions that both delegations had brought to the table. Valen found herself reassessing not just Reed's negotiating strategy, but his fundamental approach to the problem they were trying to solve. General Thyron, she said, please contact our resource management specialists and request detailed projections for joint human-Kithra mining operations. Include environmental impact assessments and long-term sustainability metrics. Thyron's expression showed surprise. This wasn't a hardline position they'd agreed on before the meeting. Your Highness, are you certain? I'm certain that we should evaluate all options based on evidence rather than assumptions, Valen said firmly. Captain Reed, would your people be willing to provide similar technical assessments from your perspective? Absolutely, Your Highness. Though I should mention that our environmental specialists have raised concerns about some of our current mining practices. We'd welcome input from Kithra expertise in sustainable resource extraction. The admission surprised Valen more than she'd expected. Most species guarded their technological weaknesses carefully during negotiations, but Reed had just acknowledged a significant limitation in human capabilities. Why are you telling me that? She asked directly. Reed met her gaze steadily. Because successful long-term partnerships require honest assessment of both strengths and weaknesses. If we're going to work together, you'll discover our limitations eventually anyway. Better to acknowledge them up front and figure out how to address them constructively. An admirably logical approach, Valen said, though she was thinking that it was also a remarkably trusting one. Though some might consider such honesty a sign of weakness. Some might, Reed agreed. But I've found that most problems get worse when you try to solve them with incomplete information or false premises. The afternoon session focused on security arrangements and border patrol protocols, areas where human and Kithra military doctrines showed fundamental differences in approach. Humans favored flexible response capabilities and rapid deployment of force, while Kithra strategy emphasized fixed defensive positions and overwhelming superiority in chosen engagement zones. Your mobile patrol concept has merit, Valen admitted, studying tactical displays that showed human border security methods. But it requires a level of real-time coordination between forces that assumes perfect communication and mutual trust. Both of which are in short supply right now, Reed said. But we have to start somewhere. Small joint patrols, shared communication protocols, gradually building the kind of working relationships that make coordination possible. You're asking us to trust human military units with the security of Dominion territory. I'm asking you to consider that security might be more effective when it's based on cooperation rather than mutual deterrence, Reed replied. Though I understand the risks from your perspective. Do you? Valen asked, her tone sharper than she'd intended. Do you understand what it means for the heir to the Stellar Dominion to authorize joint military operations with a species that my people consider fundamentally unpredictable? Reed was quiet for a moment, and Valen could see him considering not just her words but the implications behind them. When he spoke, his voice carried a different quality, more personal, less diplomatic. I understand that you're taking political risks to even consider these proposals, he said. And I understand that if this cooperation fails, the consequences for you will be more severe than they will be for me. What I don't understand is why you're willing to take those risks. The question caught Valen off guard with its directness. She looked around the conference room, at the holographic displays showing decades of conflict, at her own military advisors who were clearly concerned about the direction of the negotiations. Because, she said finally, the alternative is 2 more decades of war that will cost both our species more than either of us can afford. And because. She paused, choosing her words carefully. Because I'm beginning to think that the greatest risk isn't trusting humans. It's continuing to assume that trust is impossible. That evening, as both delegations prepared for the next day's sessions, Valen found herself walking through the ship's observation decks rather than returning to her quarters. The stars visible through the transparent steel looked the same as they had from her homeworld, but somehow the perspective felt different now. Trouble sleeping, Your Highness. She turned to find Captain Reed approaching from the direction of the human quarters, apparently engaged in the same kind of restless evening walk that had drawn her here. I find that important decisions are easier to make when viewed against the backdrop of infinity, she said. It provides useful perspective on the relative importance of various concerns. A philosopher and a diplomat, Reed observed, moving to stand beside her at the viewport. Your intelligence briefings didn't mention that combination. Your briefings probably didn't mention that you quote human poetry in your personal logs either, Valen replied. Intelligence agencies focus on politically relevant information. Reed glanced at her with something that might have been surprise. You've been reading my personal logs? A few excerpts, Valen admitted. I wanted to understand how you think about problems. Most military officers focus on tactical considerations and resource allocation. You write about moral obligations and the long-term consequences of actions taken under pressure. And what did you conclude from that analysis? Valen considered the question, looking out at the stars and thinking about the day's negotiations, about the risks and possibilities and the weight of decisions that could shape the future of two civilizations. I concluded, she said softly, that humans might be even more dangerous than I originally thought. But not in the way I expected. The crisis that changed everything began with a routine communication from the planetary surface and escalated within hours into the kind of diplomatic emergency that could either forge lasting cooperation or trigger the war both sides were trying to prevent. Your Highness, Commander IHFYI announced, bursting into the morning briefing with the kind of urgency that immediately commanded attention, we're receiving distress calls from the Meridian Valley settlement. Separatist forces have attacked the civilian population, both human and Kithra families. Valen felt the familiar cold clarity that came with genuine crisis. Casualties? Unknown, but initial reports suggest significant numbers of wounded. The Separatists appear to be using the attack as a recruitment tool, claiming that cooperation between our species is a betrayal of both human and Kithra interests. Captain Reed had gone very still in the way that Valen was learning indicated his mind shifting into tactical assessment mode. What kind of forces are we talking about? Military capability, numbers, equipment level? Mixed units, THYSS replied, consulting her data pad. Human colonial militia and Kithra dissidents, both groups well-armed and apparently coordinating their operations. They've taken control of the settlement's communication array and are broadcasting propaganda messages across the system. Broadcasting what kind of messages? Valen asked, though she suspected she already knew. Anti-cooperation rhetoric, THYSS said. Claims that the peace negotiations are a conspiracy by weak leaders to surrender sovereignty to alien influence. They're calling for pure human and Kithra territories with no interspecies contact. Reed stood and moved to the tactical display, his fingers dancing over the controls to bring up real-time satellite feeds of Meridian Valley. Rescue operation, he said without preamble. Joint human-Kithra forces, coordinated assault to secure the civilians and neutralize the separatist threat. Absolutely not, General Thyron interjected. Your Highness, we cannot risk Dominion forces in support of human colonists. The political implications are less important than the lives of innocent people, Valen cut him off, surprising herself with the vehemence of her response. Captain Reed is correct. Joint rescue operation, coordinated through both command structures. Your Highness, Thyron's voice carried the careful tone of someone delivering news that would not be well received. I've just received communication from the Imperial Court. Certain noble houses are questioning your conduct of these negotiations. They believe your cooperation with human forces indicates dangerous sympathy for alien interests. Valen felt something cold settle in her stomach. Political opposition from the noble houses could undermine not just the peace negotiations, but her position as heir apparent. Which houses? House Velthra, House Mordain, and House Kythus have formally requested that the Empress review your authority to make binding agreements with human forces. Reed looked between them, clearly recognizing the political crisis even if he didn't understand all the implications. Your Highness, if my presence here is creating problems for your position. Your presence here is the least of my problems, Captain, Valen said sharply. Then, more softly, the problems existed before you arrived. You're simply providing convenient justification for opposition that was always going to manifest. She turned to address the full room. We proceed with the joint rescue operation. Commander THYSS, coordinate with Captain Reed's forces for tactical planning. General Thyron, prepare our medical teams for casualty support. We will not allow innocent people to suffer while politicians debate the purity of their motivations. The next 6 hours were a blur of tactical planning, resource coordination, and the kind of intense cooperation that crisis makes possible even between traditional enemies. Valen found herself working directly with Reed to plan the assault, their different strategic perspectives combining to create an approach that was both more sophisticated and more flexible than either could have developed alone. Human forces will create a diversionary engagement here, Reed explained, indicating positions on the holographic battlefield display. Your people's superior defensive capabilities can establish a secure perimeter here, while mixed units extract civilians from the settlement center. The risk is acceptable, Valen agreed, but the coordination requirements are unprecedented. Our forces have never operated under joint command structure. Which is why we need clear communication protocols and fallback plans for when things go wrong, Reed said. Because they will go wrong. Operations this complex always do. An optimistic assessment, Valen observed dryly. A realistic one, Reed corrected. But manageable if we plan for contingencies instead of hoping for perfect execution. The actual rescue operation proved Reed's assessment accurate in both directions. The joint human-Kithra assault succeeded in securing the settlement and evacuating casualties with minimal losses, but not without significant complications. Communication failures led to dangerous confusion during the initial approach, cultural differences in tactical doctrine created coordination problems, and several moments when only quick thinking and mutual trust prevented friendly fire incidents. But it worked. Final casualty count, Commander THYSS reported as the last medical transport lifted off from Meridian Valley, 47 wounded, 12 serious, no fatalities. Separatist forces neutralized or dispersed. Settlement secured. Valen felt exhaustion settle over her like a physical weight, but also something else, a kind of satisfaction that came from successful cooperation under impossible circumstances. Excellent work, Commander. Please make sure our medical teams coordinate with human doctors for follow-up care. Some of the wounded will require interspecies medical protocols. Already arranged, Your Highness, Reed said, approaching with his own after-action reports. Your people's emergency medical technology is impressive. Several of our wounded owe their lives to Kithra medics. And several of ours owe theirs to human rapid response capabilities, Valen replied. It appears that cooperation has practical benefits as well as political ones. When it works, Reed agreed. Though I suspect we'll both face questions about today's operation from our respective leadership. Valen's pointed ears drooped slightly. Indeed. I've already received 3 formal communications from the Imperial Court requesting detailed justification for authorizing joint military operations. Political pressure? Significant, Valen admitted. And potentially career-ending if I can't demonstrate that today's cooperation produced results that justified the risks. Reed was quiet for a moment, studying her expression with the kind of attention that made her feel uncomfortably transparent. Would you do it again? Knowing the political costs? Without hesitation, Valen said immediately, then paused to consider why her response had been so automatic. Those people, human and Kithra families, they were in danger because extremists from both our species decided that cooperation was worse than violence. Allowing them to suffer to protect my political position would have validated everything the separatists believe about the corruption of leadership. Even if it costs you the throne. Especially if it costs me the throne, Valen said firmly. What good is political power if you're not willing to use it for something more important than maintaining political power? Reed's smile was small but genuine. That might be the most dangerous thing you've ever said, Your Highness. Why? Because it suggests you actually mean the idealistic things you say during negotiations. And people who actually mean idealistic things have a tendency to do idealistic things, even when practical people would choose differently. Valen found herself laughing despite the exhaustion and political pressure. Captain Reed, are you suggesting that I'm becoming predictably unpredictable? I'm suggesting, Reed said carefully, that you might be the most dangerous kind of leader. One who's learned to channel their principles without losing them entirely. The echo of her own earlier assessment of him wasn't lost on either of them. That evening, as both delegations dealt with the aftermath of the crisis and prepared for the inevitable political ramifications, Valen received a private communication from her mother, Empress Thiel. "My daughter," the holographic image said, her tone carrying the weight of imperial authority and maternal concern, "your actions today have created considerable discussion at court. Some view your cooperation with human forces as evidence of wisdom and adaptability. Others see it as dangerous departure from established policy." "I understand, Mother," Valen replied to the recording. "But the cooperation saved lives and demonstrated possibilities that pure separation could never achieve." "Perhaps," the Empress continued. "But you must also understand that your position as heir requires political viability as well as personal conviction. I am sending Lord Chancellor Vexthon to evaluate the situation and provide guidance for future negotiations." Valen's heart sank. Lord Chancellor Vexthon was one of the most conservative voices at court, completely opposed to any cooperation with human forces and deeply suspicious of what he called alien contamination of Kithra culture. "The Chancellor will arrive within 3 days," the Empress concluded. "I trust you will conduct yourself in a manner appropriate to your station and responsibilities." The communication ended, leaving Valen alone with the knowledge that her time for independent decision-making was rapidly running out. Whatever she hoped to accomplish with Captain Reed and the peace negotiations would have to happen quickly, before conservative court politics reasserted control over imperial policy. She stood at her quarters viewport, looking out at the stars and thinking about the day's events, about the successful cooperation that had saved lives and the political consequences that might destroy any hope of building on that success. A soft chime announced someone at her door. "Enter," she called, expecting one of her staff with additional reports or communications from the court. Instead, Captain Reed stepped into her quarters, carrying 2 cups of what appeared to be human coffee and wearing an expression of quiet determination. "Captain," she said, surprised by his presence. "Is there something urgent that requires immediate attention?" "Yes," Reed said simply, offering her one of the cups. "I think we need to talk about what happens next, and I think we need to do it honestly, without diplomatic language or political calculations." Valen accepted the coffee, noting that her hands were trembling slightly. Whether from exhaustion, stress, or something else, she wasn't certain. "That sounds like a conversation that could create significant complications for both of us." "Probably," Reed agreed. "But I think the alternatives might be worse." Looking at him standing in her quarters, offering coffee and honest conversation while both their careers hung in the balance of political decisions neither of them could control, Valen realized that she was facing the same choice she'd made during the rescue operation, the safe political option, or the right thing to do regardless of consequences. "Very well, Captain," she said, settling into a chair and gesturing for him to do the same. "Let's talk honestly about what happens next." The attack came during what should have been the final peace ceremony, when both delegations had gathered in the diplomatic hall to sign formal agreements that had taken weeks to negotiate. Valen stood beside Captain Reed at the ceremonial table, both of them wearing formal dress uniforms that represented their respective governments' commitment to the peace process, when the first explosion shattered the hall's main viewport. "Assassins!" General Thyron shouted, drawing his sidearm as armed figures in unmarked combat gear poured through the breach. "Protect the princess!" But the attackers weren't random extremists, they moved with military precision, their equipment was sophisticated, and their targeting was specific. They wanted both Valen and Reed dead, hoping to trigger the all-out war that peace threatened to prevent. "This way!" Reed called, grabbing Valen's hand and pulling her toward the emergency exits as energy weapons fire erupted around them. "The service corridors. They'll provide better cover." Valen's formal ceremonial robes made running awkward, but Reed's tactical training kept them moving through the chaos as both human and Kithra security forces engaged the attackers. The precision of the assault was chilling, whoever had planned this knew the ship's layout, the ceremony's timing, and exactly where both delegation leaders would be positioned. The communication array, Valen gasped as they reached relative safety in a sealed corridor. "We need to warn both fleets that this is a false flag operation." If they think we've been killed by the other side, they'll start shooting at each other instead of hunting for the real conspirators," Reed finished. "Can you access ship communications from here?" "Emergency override, yes." Valen's fingers flew over a wall-mounted control panel, her royal access codes opening channels that would normally require bridge authorization. "But we need evidence of who's really behind this, not just our word that it wasn't either of our governments." The sound of combat was moving closer, suggesting that the attackers were pushing deeper into the ship despite resistance from security forces. Reed checked his sidearm's charge level and moved to cover the corridor entrance. "Your Chancellor," he said grimly. "Lord Vexthon arrived yesterday with his own security detail. Very convenient timing." "I was thinking the same thing about your Colonel Harrison's last-minute personnel additions to your delegation," Valen replied, establishing communication links to both fleets. Someone on both sides wanted this peace process to fail dramatically. A new explosion echoed through the ship, this one close enough to make the deck plates vibrate. Emergency lighting activated as the main power systems fluctuated, casting the corridor in alternating red and amber illumination. "Movement," Reed warned, raising his weapon as figures appeared at the far end of the corridor. "Friendly or hostile?" "Princess Valen," came Commander IHFYI's voice. "Are you injured?" "We're intact," Valen called back. "Status report." "Attackers have been neutralized or driven off," IHFYI reported as she approached with a mixed group of human and Kithra security personnel. "But we found something you need to see." She handed Valen a data pad containing captured intelligence from the attackers' equipment. The files revealed what Valen had suspected but hoped wasn't true. The conspiracy involved extremist factions from both species, funded by third-party interests who profited from continued human-Kithra conflict. "Weapons merchants," Reed said, reading over her shoulder. "And territorial speculators betting on expanded conflict zones. They've been financing separatist groups on both sides. Including elements within my own court," Valen said, her voice tight with controlled anger as she recognized several names on the intelligence list. "And apparently within your colonial administration as well. The evidence is comprehensive," IHFYI added. "Communication logs, financial transfers, operational planning documents. Enough to prove the conspiracy in any court of law." Valen looked around at the mixed human-Kithra security team that had worked together to defend the ship, at the intelligence that proved their enemies were willing to commit murder to prevent cooperation, at Captain Reed whose immediate instinct had been to protect her rather than secure his own safety. "Send this intelligence to both fleets immediately," she ordered. "Full disclosure, all evidence, complete transparency about the conspiracy and its backers." "Your Highness," one of her advisors protested, "some of this intelligence implicates members of the Imperial Court." "The political ramifications." "The political ramifications of covering up treason are worse than the political ramifications of exposing it," Valen said firmly. "Captain Reed, will your people support full disclosure even if it embarrasses elements of your own government?" "Without question," Reed replied. "The people who planned this betrayed everything both our species are supposed to stand for." "Then we proceed with complete honesty," Valen decided. "Whatever the political costs." The aftermath of the assassination attempt became a watershed moment for both species. The evidence of third-party manipulation helped human and Kithra leadership understand that their conflicts had been artificially intensified by external interests, while the successful cooperation between security forces during the crisis demonstrated the practical benefits of alliance. But it was during Valen's recovery from injuries sustained when she'd shielded Reed from an explosion that the most important conversations took place. "You didn't have to do that," Reed said, sitting beside her medical bed as Kithra doctors finished treating the energy weapon burns on her arm. "Protecting me could have gotten you killed." "Yes," Valen agreed, flexing her bandaged arm to test the healing. "But letting you get killed would have guaranteed the failure of everything we've been working toward." "Is that the only reason?" Valen met his gaze, recognizing the question behind the question. "No," she said quietly. "It's not the only reason. The intelligence reports are being well received by both governments, Reed said, changing the subject to safer ground. Your mother has personally commended your handling of the crisis, and my superiors are recommending you for a human diplomatic honor. Political rehabilitation through heroism, Valen observed. How convenient. Is that cynicism I hear from the idealistic princess? Realism, Valen corrected. I understand that my actions during the crisis have strengthened my political position, but I also understand that politics will eventually reassert themselves. The peace agreements will be signed, formal relations will be established, and both of us will be reassigned to new duties that don't involve working together. Reed nodded slowly. Probably true. The success of this mission means we'll both be considered valuable for other diplomatic assignments. Other assignments with other species, in other systems, representing our respective governments' interests in situations that don't involve personal collaboration. Most likely. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, both understanding what wasn't being said directly. The peace process had succeeded beyond anyone's expectations, creating possibilities for human-Kithra cooperation that would benefit both species for generations. But that success also meant the end of their unique partnership. Marcus, Valen said, using his first name for the first time, what we've accomplished here, do you think it was worth the risks? To both our careers? To the political stability we've both disrupted? To the certainty we've both sacrificed? Reed considered the question seriously. Yes. Absolutely. What we've proven is more important than what we've cost ourselves. And personally? Was it worth the personal risks? Reed's smile was sad but genuine. Valen, working with you has been the most important assignment of my career, and knowing you has been the most important relationship of my life. Whatever happens next, I'll never regret the choice to trust you. Even though that trust has led to impossible complications. Especially because of that, Reed said. The easy relationships don't teach you anything important about yourself or the universe. That night, after the medical staff had completed their final checks and the political communications had been sent and received, Valen made a decision that surprised everyone, including herself. The soft sound of her quarters door opening brought Reed instantly awake, his military training making him alert despite the day's exhaustion. He sat up to find Valen standing in the entrance, wearing simple sleeping robes and an expression that combined determination with vulnerability. Valen, he said softly. Is everything all right? She didn't answer immediately, instead moving to stand beside his bed with the same careful grace that characterized all her movements. I've spent my entire life making decisions based on political calculations and royal obligations, she said finally. I've chosen my words, my actions, my relationships based on what would best serve the Dominion and my position within it. That's what leaders do, Reed said gently. The burden of responsibility. Tonight, I want to make a choice based on what I want rather than what duty demands. She looked down at him, her amber eyes reflecting the soft lighting from the ship's night cycle. I want to trust someone completely, without political calculation or strategic consideration. I want to sleep beside someone I trust absolutely, even if that trust is dangerous. Reed moved over in the bed, creating space beside him without question or hesitation. Are you sure? I'm sure that you're the most dangerous person I've ever met, Valen said, settling beside him with careful attention to appropriate boundaries. Dangerous because you make me want to believe that cooperation is possible, that trust can be earned, that some people are worth the risk of vulnerability. And you're the most dangerous person I've ever met, Reed replied, because you make me want to believe that idealism and pragmatism can coexist, that some principles are worth defending regardless of personal cost. They lay in comfortable silence, close enough to share warmth but not touching, both understanding that the gesture was about trust rather than romance, about choosing connection over the safer distance that duty would normally require. What happens tomorrow? Valen asked softly. Tomorrow we finish the peace agreements, arrange for ongoing cooperation protocols, and prepare for our respective reassignments, Reed replied. We do our duty as representatives of our species. And tonight? Tonight, Reed said, we're just two people who've learned to trust each other against all reasonable expectations. Valen's breathing gradually deepened into the rhythm of sleep, and Reed found himself thinking about the impossible nature of their situation, two people from different species, different governments, different worlds, who had somehow found a connection that transcended all the barriers that should have kept them apart. When morning came, they would return to their roles as princess and captain, as representatives of competing interests who had learned to cooperate for the greater good. But tonight, in the quiet darkness of a ship traveling between stars, they were simply two people who had chosen trust over fear, connection over isolation, and the dangerous possibility of hope over the safer certainty of separation. Some choices, Reed reflected as he listened to Valen's peaceful breathing beside him, were worth making even when, especially when, they changed everything you thought you knew about what was possible.